The Mountain Lion by Gene Stafford. Chapter 3. Just as 5 days before, when they had waited for Grandpa Kenyon, Ralph and Molly lay on the Lipia lawn, waiting for their uncle. An airplane flew across the sky. Its pilot was stunting, and as they watched, breathlessly, he took a nosedive. "The big fool," cried Ralph. "He's going to hit the pump house." And then he smiled as he saw the plane cleverly climb up again. It occurred to him with pain that Grandpa Kenyon, who loved all unusual experience, had died before he had ever gone up in an airplane. Nor had he ever got to see the racing fellow, Barney Oldfield, of whom he had often spoken with admiration. What would next September be like without him? Associated as he had been with the renewal of crowded days after the tranquil ennui of the summer, he had seemed to the children, after he had gone, half legendary, like a figure known only in his identification with a particular place or a particular day of the year. He was a sort of god of September, surrounded by the gold autumnal light. What Ralph missed most already was the early morning ceremony in which he alone participated with Grandpa. The old man kept his usual hours when he visited in Covina, and always got up before daylight to make his own breakfast. The fragrance of the coffee he made was so manly and stimulating that Ralph could reproduce the sensation of it at will throughout the day, and could therefore daydream under the most adverse schoolroom conditions. Ralph, creeping downstairs in his stocking feet lest he awaken his mothers and sisters, would find Grandpa Kenyon sitting by the stove in the half-light, his black hat pushed back from his forehead and his glasses midway down his nose. He would be waiting for the griddle to heat up for his flapjacks, but the coffee would be made already, and the kitchen would be full of its strong, rather rancid smell. They did not speak to one another until the meal was over and Grandpa had lighted his pipe. At this point he always took off his hat. Ralph could never guess why. At these times he told no stories, but instead talked with homesickness of the chores that were now proceeding on his ranches. Just about now in Texas, the whole outfit would be fixing to go up to the range and cut out the beeves to be shipped to Panama. In Colorado, where they kept lazier hours, the old colored woman Magdalene would be calling the men to breakfast. As he stated these facts, he kept his eye on his watch. When the second hand had completed its circuit, he would say, "She's setting the coffee pot down by Claude." Ralph discerned contempt in Grandpa's glance through the windows at the tidy grove with its toy-like trees, where the Mexicans would not come for 2 hours yet. And when he heard the milkman come, he sometimes grew angry, thumping his fist on the table and shouting at the boy, "Lord God Almighty, she could keep one cow anyway. She had ought to be ashamed." She was not ashamed, but Ralph was. And once he declared that he would not touch milk again until she got a cow. Her reply was a familiar and irrefutable one. "Our sort of people don't have cows." Ralph wondered if, after all, Grandpa would have liked the joke about the cow. He wondered, too, if he dared tell it to Uncle Claude, or if this would seem unbecoming on the day of the funeral. Uncle Claude. Uncle Claude. Uncle Claude. He said the name over and over to himself, but it brought no picture to his mind. He could not imagine what Grandpa's son would be like, and because he could not, the thought of meeting him made him shy. At the same time, he became aware that Molly was crying, and had been for some time. He saw the car coming round the bend in the lane where the blue cedars grew, and with no plan at all in his mind, he jumped to his feet and ran at top speed across the lawn and past the solar tank. As he ran, he thought, "Now I pass the garden, and Leah and Rachel haven't seen me. Now I am passing the solar tank. Now I am passing the den, and in the den I am passing the deer head, and the deer head hasn't seen me. Now the pantry, and Mother isn't there, and Fuchsia isn't there. And now I am safe." He ran to the pump house and climbed a ladder as quickly as a mouse. Once on top, he squatted on his heels on the round roof. His heart pounded as deeply as the pump pulsed below him. He had no idea why he had not wanted to see his uncle. It was as if he had got to control himself by complete physical escape. by exposing himself to the perfectly empty sky, and by him enclosing himself in this perfectly round small area where shapes and colors were of the simplest. The sanctuary was round, its floor was black, the sky was blue, and he was alone. He would not look down, but he could hear voices. His mother said, "Dear Claude, it is a sorrowful time for all of us." If the air had not been so still, Ralph would have not heard the man's reply, for his voice was so soft. It was so soft and sad that Ralph thought he must be sitting on the steps with his head between his hands in anguish. He said, "Can I see Mr. Kenyon, ma'am?" The boy saw his uncle all by himself, casting his shadow on a white desert, on the terribly unearthly stretch of land he had seen from the train the summer they had gone to St. Louis. There had been miles and miles of nothing but sand until finally the train passed a giant pear cactus, and Mrs. Fawcett, in an explanatory voice, had said, "You know, that little bit of shade would mean a great deal to someone who got stranded here." Mr. Follansby and his wife came to luncheon after the funeral. Mr. Follansby sat at Mrs. Fawcett's right and told jokes which the children and Uncle Claude did not understand, although Leah and Rachel pretended to. He was an unpleasant-looking man, with a small upturned chin and a large downturned nose, and his whole face was thin and malign. Mrs. Fawcett said he had a typical Yankee face, but Ralph could never reconcile this with the song Yankee Doodle, which was, he thought, about a man something like Santa Claus. Molly had decided, though, that if Uncle Sam were clean-shaven, he would probably look a good deal like the minister. He wore a morning coat. Mrs. Follansby, like Mrs. Fawcett, was dressed in black. Each child wore a sign of mourning. Ralph wore black knickerbockers and black stockings, and the three little girls wore black Windsor ties at the necks of their midi blouses. In this decent gathering, Uncle Claude was a gaudy incongruity. His suit was a chocolate brown, his shirt was a deep blue, and his tie was scarlet. There was no black about him, save for his black hair and his black eyes. His whole color scheme was like that of a rooster. He was a younger and slighter version of Grandpa. His jawbones were broad and his cheekbones high, but his chin was rather small, and Ralph realized with a shock that probably Grandpa's had been too, and that was why he wore a beard. Uncle Claude's shoulders were massive, bullish, and his arms hung forward from them in an animal heaviness, terminating in the biggest hands the boy had ever seen. These hands, whose fingers had been enlarged and discolored as his father's had been, were long, but were so wide that on the damask tablecloth and handling the coin-silver spoons, they looked scarcely like hands at all, but slabs of meat with the rind still on. Leah and Rachel, scornful of his cheap, ugly suit, it looked like the one the Watkins man wore, had said that he looked simple-minded, and they hoped that they would not have to sit next to him at the funeral. It was that his face was so innocent. He did not seem to know what had happened to him. And this house, these little girls, the appointments of this table were not in his line. You could tell he wished he had not come, but he was not simple-minded. He had hardly spoken at all since his arrival. After he had seen his father, he had gone to the guest room and had remained there until it was time to leave for the service. Molly, hugging the trunk of the umbrella tree, had seen him standing at the oriel in the upstairs hall, looking down when the men came to fetch away the coffin to take it to the church. His silence had infected the others, and even Mrs. Fawcett's tongue had been stilled on the drive to the cemetery and home again. But now that all was over, she believed a lighter tone should prevail to efface, if possible, the sorrowful reason for their gathering together. The talk, therefore, at the luncheon table was jovial and irrelevant. Mr. Follansby started it by telling a story about an earnest young lady, the daughter of a remote cousin of Mrs. Follansby's, who had been sent to them with a letter of introduction for a short visit before she entered a boarding school in Pasadena. "Oh, Rose, you will like this, I know," he said. "I can just imagine your good father in a similar position." To Uncle Claude he explained, "I, an immigrant to California like everyone else. These four little Fawcetts are the only California natives of my acquaintance, ha-ha. and in the dim dark past I had the honor of hearing Mrs. Fawcett's father hold forth on cultural subjects far into many a night. I must confess that sometimes for me the midnight oil gave off soporific fumes, but as that most learned gentleman would have said himself, aliquando bonus dormitate Homerus. That is, even good Homer sometimes nods. Claude Kenyon, flanked by Ralph and Molly, looked bashfully at his plate of jellied soup and did not even pretend to smile. The preacher, with a hint of exasperation in his face, but none in his deep oratorical voice, continued. This good lass came with loads of luggage, all of it as heavy as lead, full of books, do you see? As pretty as a picture she was, and no earthly reason for her to be smart as well. Look there at Leah and Rachel pricking up their ears. Yet she was smart, but the pity of it was that she wasn't really bright. You call that a paradox? Well, I have a funny sort of little old mind, and I maintain a person can be intellectual and not be intelligent. But don't let me make a sermon right here. On to the story. Well, sir, the first thing, the pretty little slip of a thing was with us. We were taking our coffee in the library, a custom I have not been able to outgrow even after many years in this newfangled nation of California. And lo and behold, and mirabile dictu, Milady says to me very seriously, very soberly, Mr. Follansby, have you ever read Shakespeare? Mrs. Fawcett, who had been ready from the beginning of the anecdote, now laughed until she had to wipe her eyes. Mrs. Follansby, who had been present and could not be expected to react quite as she had done at the time, was milder. Leah and Rachel covered their mouths with their napkins, through which came peals of laughter. But the minister had expected this applause and did not so much as glance at any of them, but fixed his eyes on Uncle Claude with a look of malicious amusement. When Uncle Claude blushed, his skin took on an apoplectic blue, and Ralph, who had not been able even to grin, shuddered when he looked at him. When there had been enough laughter, Mr. Follansby, still looking at Claude, said, Sir, I envy you your snowy winters. I miss them here in California. Back in Missouri on snowy nights, I used to go through the historical plays, read them and reread them to my great edification. I imagine you do much the same thing. I expect when you're snowbound the time may hang heavy on your hands. Literature is a great medicine. It takes us out of ourselves. Claude put his spoon down clumsily, and it made a loud clatter on the plate under his soup cup. His ashamed eyes lifted waveringly to the minister's as he sighed. And then he said, I couldn't rightly say I find the time hanging heavy. I have a sight of cows to feed. All the same, cried Mrs. Fawcett, frantically embarrassed, I expect you managed to find the time to read. Mr. Follansby, Claude was the most precocious youngster you ever saw, and who should be a better judge of that than I? Why, he was reading Lorna Doone when he was just a little bit of a thing. This profession fell flat, but she barely paused. Don't you remember the many, many times we used to go out to the summer house and read Tennyson aloud? How you loved the Idylls of the King. For several minutes she talked rapidly and distractedly about Tennyson, Claude's early love for him, her own love for him, her father's love for him. She did not relinquish the conversation until it was at a safe distance from the question of how Uncle Claude passed the time on a winter evening. Later on, she confided in her children that she had been on tenterhooks for fear Claude would tell them what he did read. For she assumed that his tastes would be like those of his father, who had never been seen reading a book, and who had never mentioned any but the novels of Gabirol, which certainly could not be called classics. As far as the ancient languages went, these might have been the Dark Ages for all Mr. Kenyon had known of them. And Mrs. Fawcett suspected that his son had not known what mirabile dictu meant. Mr. Follansby experimented with another gambit. His hobby was taxidermy, and his house, which smelled of mud, was full of stuffed skunks, raccoons, woodpeckers, bluebirds, and cottontails, the corpses being brought to him by his obedient flock, some of whom felt that for a minister the pastime was unduly skittish. He asked Uncle Claude if he had any interest in the subject, and when Uncle Claude replied that he had never thought about it one way or the other, Mr. Follansby said, I'm just like a boy about it, as my long-suffering better half will testify. Why, yesterday I got a batch of new supplies, and I stopped work right in the middle of my sermon to open the parcel. They had made a rather comical mistake. I had written for eyes of a vulture, and they sent instead the eyes of the extinct auk. Molly spoke for the first time. She closed her eyes and chanted. A is for auk, who lives in the wet. B is for blackbird with wings of jet. And Uncle Claude turned to her and smiled. But Mrs. Fawcett, to whom actually the minister's handling of dead animals was extremely repugnant, told her not to interrupt, and she asked what on earth he had done, since obviously one could not substitute an auk's eyes for a vulture's eyes. He answered that he had sent them back and would, until the genuine article arrived, work on a gopher, which Kenneth Taliaferro had brought him. At this mention of her lover's name, Rachel giggled. Mr. Follansby reached across the table and delicately pulled her hair. Oh, stop it, thought Ralph. The meal progressed as if the silent Outlander were not there. Leah and Rachel, interrogated by the minister, showed their wares boldly. Yes, indeed, they surely were glad they were going to boarding school next year in New Haven, where they would have an opportunity to study French and music, but most of all to study elocution under somewhat of more gumption than the rather ungifted and certainly homely Mrs. Sawhill, to whom they went on Saturday afternoon after their dancing lesson with the equally uninspired but less plain Mrs. Lanier. Both the minister and his wife laughed happily when Rachel, speaking of Mrs. Sawhill, said, "And I never can keep my mind on the piece I'm speaking because she mouths the words, and I'm afraid her false teeth are going to fall out because they do wobble so." Leah, not to be outdone, said of Mrs. Lanier, "Yes, but that's not half as bad as in ballet when she takes off her slipper and rubs her bunion." It was said that Mrs. Fawcett was brave to let her little girls go all the way across the country, even though Aunt Rowena would be near them to keep an eye on them. It was observed by the girls that they were already homesick. Molly bubbled her water and said, "A child in my grade has the itch." "Molly," said her mother, vigorously shaking her head, "shame on you." Everyone ignored the impossible child. A hideous accident attended the serving of the dessert. Uncle Claude had failed to remove his finger bowl from his plate, and when Fuchsia brought around the raspberry ice, he put his portion into the water, splashing it on the table. Leah and Rachel could not contain themselves any longer and burst into laughter. To double his humiliation, the others chose pointedly to pay no attention to the calamity, and Mrs. Fawcett, in a flash of venomous discourtesy, said, "I declare I do not understand why these girls can suddenly laugh their heads off at nothing at all." Ralph felt physically sick, and was afraid that if the meal did not end quickly, he might disgrace himself right there at the table. Never had he so passionately despised Mr. Follansby's cruel, smug face, his pince-nez on a black ribbon, the effeminate white piping of his vest. Grandpa Kenyon had, next to merchants, disliked clergymen more than any other people, and Ralph agreed with him, for he was sure they were all like Mr. Follansby. Grandpa Shillelagh had been sent to him from Cork by his brother, who was a clergyman, and who had undertaken to preach the gospel English style to those poor backward natives. By the way he said it, the children knew that he did not think the Irish were poor and backward at all, and that he was really making fun of his brother. He had another brother who was also a clergyman, a missionary in China, and his sister Nan was an Anglican nun. Mrs. Fawcett always told him before the Follansbys came to the buffet supper that it would perhaps be just as well for him not to mention his brothers and sisters, as Mr. Follansby had very decided opinions on anything the least bit Romish. She was afraid he was secretly displeased that her land adjoined that of the Freudenbergs, who were Romans, and went in for all kinds of superstitions, like fish on Friday and statues of the Virgin on top of the piano. Ralph wondered if the Shaughnessund had to eat fish on Friday, too. Probably they gave him potatoes instead. The horrible pastor looked at Ralph and for some reason winked his light green reptilian eye. The boy trembled and looked away, and this time glanced with ardent loathing at Mrs. Follansby's round, puffy face, whose vulgar snub nose complemented her husband's downward curving one. He particularly hated her nose because she had chronic catarrh, and tried, because of it, to identify herself with him and Molly, who were similarly afflicted. While she was therefore ostensibly becoming their contemporary, she spoke of their kinship in baby talk, and in the loud voice ladies used in addressing servants and foreigners. The only thing that could be said in her favor was that she did not talk as much as her husband. Otherwise, she was just as bad, and Ralph wished both of them would get bubonic plague. "Who has the itch?" he suddenly asked Molly. "Ralph!" cried Mrs. Fawcett. "That is not to be discussed at the table." But Molly said, "Beulah, the one that stole my nickel." "That will be enough, Molly," said Mrs. Fawcett. She dipped her fingers into the crystal bowl of water and dried them on her napkin, and everyone did the same except Uncle Claude, who could not wash in his dessert. Ralph's nausea and resentment ebbed. In a moment it would be over. There would only be 2 more meals, and the Follansbys wouldn't be at those. While he wanted Uncle Claude to like him, he was glad that he was leaving the next day so that Leah and Rachel would stop giggling at his wrong clothes and his table manners and his language. He was determined not to let him go, though, without explaining to him that he and Molly were different from the rest of the family. And there was another thing. There were the presents Grandpa had not given them, so now they would really be Uncle Claude's presents. But how could he ask for them? Again, he wondered if he could tell the joke about the cow, but it did not seem quite right. Uncle Claude seemed too serious, even though he had smiled at Molly when she recited the alphabet thing. After lunch, it was suggested that Uncle Claude would like to take a nap, for he had had no rest at all since he had left home. The fact that he had unaccountably come all the way to Denver by day coach was not alluded to before the Follansbys. The minister, who was the host in any house he entered, thought a game of 20 questions would be as decorous an amusement as any. Mrs. Fawcett, agreeing, said that afterward Leah and Rachel could recite their new Scottish dialogue. They sauntered slowly to the parlor, Molly and Ralph and Uncle Claude at the rear. As Uncle Claude turned toward the stairs, he said, "If that Beulah stole your nickel, it serves her right to have the itch." Most of the flowers had been taken out of the parlor and laid on Grandpa's grave, but the air was still heavy with fragrance. The room was altered. Although nothing had been moved or added, it was not the same place it had been before, and Ralph could not imagine the ladies of the Cirrhosis sitting here eating ice cream in tiny bites off the tip end of their spoons and talking, giving prices of the January white sales in Los Angeles. But no one else appeared aware of the transformation. They all picked their chairs and settled down and looked around as if nothing at all had happened, as if the long, old, dead man had not been here just a few hours before. For a little while no one spoke. It was as if they were all consciously digesting their lunch. They heard Uncle Claude move down the L, quietly like a dog. It was warm, so Mrs. Fawcett took off her black, broadcloth jacket. She wore a pink crepe de chine guimpe, through which showed the deep lace yoke of her camisole, and at her throat she wore a cameo brooch, which Grandpa Kenyon had given her as an engagement present. She did not especially like it, finding it too large to be really refined, but she had often worn it during his visits. "Well," said Mr. Follansby, at last. Ralph, closing his eyes, could believe that they were in church, and that Mr. Follansby was standing before the pulpit, while the deacons, Mr. Brewster and Mr. Prater, sat behind him, monumental, bald, inexorably dull, looking very much like Grandfather Bonney. The sermon presently would begin. His voice always trailed dramatically down at the end of every sentence during the last 20 minutes, so that you were deceived 100 times, thinking he was nearly through. He was not quite ready for his flock to play 20 questions. Instead, looking up at the portrait, he made an astonishing statement. He said, "Well, Ralph, my boy, it wouldn't be hard to imagine him as the President of the United States, would it?" Ralph was too dumbfounded to reply, and Leah said, "It certainly wouldn't, Mr. Follansby. Why do you suppose he never was?" Mrs. Fawcett touched her point lace handkerchief to her eyes. There promised to be a scene of sadness and memory, but Rachel, who had been seized all day with the giggles, prevented it by giggling, burying her head in Leah's shoulder, and saying in a stage whisper, "Imagine Grandpa Kenyon as the president, though?" Leah said, laughing, "Now you just stop laughing it, you horrid girl." But Rachel could not stop, and she went on conjecturing how the Senate would like it when Mr. Kenyon said, "By the Lord Harry," and how funny he would look in a top hat like Mr. Harding's. The grown-ups pretended not to hear, but they were smiling all the same at the wicked, witty little girl. Ralph and Molly, side by side on a hassock, kept a glum silence until at last Ralph said bitterly, "Nobody but a boob would want to be the president." It was the first time in his life that he had ever shown temper in the presence of anyone but his immediate family, and it gave him a feeling of lunatic power. Rachel looked slapped. His mother, most likely deep in a dream of boating parties on the Potomac and picnics on the White House lawn, looked at him reproachfully. The minister, unaccustomed to having his speculations rejected, arranged his cunning vulpine face to give him his comeuppance. But Ralph got ahead of him. He said, "Did you know that Grandpa Kenyon killed a man once, Mr. Follansbee?" Mrs. Fawcett said, "You poor silly it. You should never take any of Mr. Kenyon's stories seriously. He was only telling you a western yawn, Ralphie boy." Mr. Follansbee could scarcely conceal his curiosity, but he said, "They are the salt of the earth, these tale-tellers. The farther they get from the truth, the better the tale." "Oh no, this wasn't a made-up one," insisted Ralph. "Grandpa really did kill a man. Probably more than one, I guess, but I only know just about this one." The man folded his hands and slightly teetered on his chair, and said indulgently, "Let's hear this true confession, laddie." "Oh, do you think it's right?" asked Mrs. Follansbee, and her pop eyes strayed to the place where the coffin had so recently been. "Don't you think it seems a little disrespectful?" But her husband, quoting in his brief homily from Some Starbeams of Solace, assured them all that the deceased would have enjoyed this himself. Ralph began with self-assurance, but it waned as he went on. He could not tell the tale as Grandpa told it. He himself was shocked and disbelieving, and could not recapture the feeling of wonder he had known that day the year before when he and Molly and Grandpa had sat together under a tree in the grove. He had been telling them that when he had been in Texas the week before, he had had to take measures about some sheep that had got into his pastures, and that he had not a bit liked to blow those little lambs to glory, one in particular that he would have liked to bring to Molly. Ralph immediately saw the lamb that Jesus carried in the Bible picture, one awkward leg hanging over his arm. Molly said, "Then why did you blow the lamb to glory, Grandpa?" And the old man answered, "Well, I'll tell you, Molly, I'd rather kill the sheep than kill the shepherd." He stopped to light his pipe. They were far from the nut-gatherers now, at the north end of the grove where the trees had been stripped and the ground gleaned. There was an acrid smell everywhere of the splitting holes in the bleaching acids. Ralph said, "Did you ever kill a shepherd?" "Yes, sir," said Grandpa. "I own I did." As he told his story, Ralph could see him, a young man riding like the wind through the dark Texas night, his money belt full of silver and gold, his twin revolvers ready to be drawn. Months before, he and his outfit had driven a shipment of steers to Dodge City, and he was coming back home again. He had left the train at Amarillo and had come horseback the remaining 14 miles. "My horse was called Pearl," he said, "and she was a dandy piece of jewelry." He had been in sight of his place and had seen down a light in the bunkhouse, down in the hollow, some way off yet. And when a couple of men had charged him suddenly, riding at a lope out from the shadows of a thicket of screwbean. There was no moon, but the night was clear, and he was able to tell who they were by the starlight. They were brothers by the name of Manillan, not good Scotch, as the name sounded, but half-breed Creeks, murderous and thieving. There had been ill will between them and Kenyon for a long time, for they had used his land to pasture their flocks, and if he or any of his men caught a McNeil sheep there, they disposed of it, after giving the boys good warning. In retaliation, the scalawags rustled his cattle. The pattern was an endless circle. As they came on him tonight, they must have heard somehow that he would be riding in alone, and with tolerable money on his person, they fired into the air to frighten Pearl, for they were that underhanded. They wanted to unseat him and have him on the ground at their mercy. Grandpa did not wait to find out what their business was, and he stuck to his saddle as if he were nailed to it, though his mare leaped in terror. He shot the taller of the two cleanly through the heart, and the other turned yellow and rode off the way he had come, not even dismounting to pay his respects to his dead brother. Ralph remembered that when he had finished. Molly had asked if, in the morning, the two ravens of the ballad Grandpa sometimes sang had come to pluck out the man's bonny blue eyes. The way Grandpa had told it, it had taken a long while, 15 minutes or more. But Ralph, half crying, took only 2 or 3, and at the end he realized that he did not believe a word of it. Leah pursed her lips. "I don't think it's nice to make up stories about killing people. I think it's awful." Ralph turned on her, and with the maniac laugh he and Molly had invented, shouted, "You mean because Mother killed Grandfather Bonnie?" But suddenly a mockingbird in this broad daylight began to sing. Mrs. Fawcett clasped her hands together and said, "Oh," as if the sound hurt her. Her large diamond ring in the gesture came into a ray of sunlight, and 2 green needles shot out from the stone. Then Mr. Follansby was across the room in one stride, shaking Ralph's shoulder. "You little cad," he said between his teeth. "You get down on your knees and beg your mother's pardon. On your knees." For a moment he defied the minister by remaining motionless, but the long, bony hand on his shoulder propelled him off the hassock, and at last he knelt, not feeling sorry, feeling nothing but rage, as painful as a deep cut. He could not utter a word, though this delay was agonizing, and they were all watching him, and they were all waiting. He could hear Mr. Follansby breathing heavily. Then Molly, half under her breath, said, "I wish you were a fairy, Mr. Follansby." Rachel giggled, but Mr. Follansby did not think this was funny, and he snarled, "What's this? Why do you wish I was a fairy, young lady?" And Molly whispered with deadly hatred, "So you'd vanish." And now he could speak. Now, with his ally beside him, kneeling and clutching his hand, he could tell the lie. "I'm sorry, Mother. Please forgive me, Mother." Molly said it after him in that queer, hoarse whisper in which she had insulted Mr. Follansby. Mrs. Fawcett patted his head, but she said firmly, "You may leave the room, Ralph." Molly did not get off so lightly. Mrs. Fawcett slapped her face, not hard, but so that it made a sound. "Mr. Follansby will never want to come to our house again after this terrible thing you have said. You may go ask Fuchsia to lock you in the closet." Ralph did not go to his room, which was directly over the parlor, but to Molly's. On the little white desk under the window she had laid out the presents from Grandpa Kenyon in the order in which he had given them to her. A doll made of straw with a sombrero that could be taken off, a suede bookmark with a burned-in design of yucca, a pair of bearskin slippers which were now too small, a totem pole 3 inches high which listed like the Leaning Tower of Pisa, a jewel box made of fragrant lemon wood and carved all over with squash blossoms, a beaded belt. Ralph touched them one by one and thought of his sister standing in the dark in the coat closet, which smelled of naphtha and of buttons. His anger had given way to fear, to the fear of the sermon Mr. Follansby would preach next Sunday, 2 days away. They always sat in the very front, so that there was no escaping his darting eyes, and you had to pay attention every minute, even when you had a hangnail or something like that to play with. There was a copy of Gravel on Molly's desk, and he read it again, and it still didn't make any sense to him. There was also a letter which she had written to their cousin Mildred, whom she did not like at all, but to whom she wrote once a week because Mildred had sent her some stationery for her birthday. Ralph read it, even though he knew it was against the law to read other people's mail. "Dear Mildred, how are you? I am fine, and hope you are the same. How are you getting along in school? Do you think long division is hard? I do. The Snake and the File. A snake one day crept into a blacksmith's shop, and chanced to knock against a steel file. This hurt the snake slightly, and, flying into a rage, he at once bit the file as hard as he could. The hard steel file cut the snake mouth, but when he saw the blood, he thought it was the file that bled, and so he bit again and again until he had damaged his own mouth very badly. When we try to hurt other people, we are much more likely to get hurt ourselves. Isn't that a funny story? I guess that is all I can say, so I will close. Your cousin, Molly F." He put the letter down, baffled. Molly was going crazy, he decided, and the thought made him nervous. If it were true, that was all the more reason he should get to be Uncle Claude's best friend, because if they had to take her to an asylum, he certainly wouldn't want to stay around here with those women. He would have to go to Colorado. He wanted to go into Uncle Claude's room, but he might be asleep, and if Ralph woke him up, he might be angry. On the other hand, if he were just sitting there thinking of Grandpa, perhaps he would be glad to have company. He debated, looking at Molly's presents. Soon he heard them all go out to the front porch, and almost immediately Leah and Rachel began their recitation. Now and again the grown-ups laughed, and then, when they had quieted down, the girls went on. It was about a girl and a boy named Jock and Jean, and at the end of it, they would sing Comin' Through the Rye. He felt suddenly that he could not bear to hear the song, which always reminded him of the time Miss Runyon had come over to play Snap with them, and at the end of the evening sang that song in a trembly voice, and to make it all the more terrible, there was a piece of fudge on her front tooth. Hearing more laughter from the porch, he got up and went down the corridor to the L. Ralph was surprised to see that the door of the guest room was open, and Uncle Claude was lying in the middle of the double bed, flat on his back with his arms straight at his sides. He had taken off his bright orange Oxfords and his coat, so that Ralph could see the black and green horsehair belt. It had a design like a snake's back. The shades were drawn. Grandpa's grip was still on the luggage stand, and Uncle Claude's small Boston bag, unopened, stood in the middle of the floor. A cigarette was burning in the pin tray on the dresser. As he stepped across the threshold, Ralph was uneasy, and he would have gone back to Molly's room if his uncle had not heard him and jerked up on his elbow. "Your door was open?" he said. "You can close it now," said Uncle Ralph. Ralph hesitated, his hand wetly grasping the doorknob. "With me outside or in?" he asked. "Suit yourself." He went into the room and closed the door. Something inside him twitched like a cat's tail, and he was afraid he might have a nosebleed. Fuchsia and Miguel were having their lunch in the kitchen directly below the guest room, and he heard a soft and urgent conversation. It was possible here only to hear the voices on the front porch as an uneven murmur. He was sure Uncle Claude had not heard what had happened in the parlor. Desperate, he looked around the room. "Oh, can I bring you your cigarette, Uncle Claude?" His uncle got up and went over to the bureau and brushed his hair with 2 military brushes that had belonged to Ralph's father. He wore his hair parted in the middle and slicked down on either side. He ground out the cigarette and lighted a fresh one, and then he sat down in the white rocking chair by the window and said, "Is this the room where he died?" "Oh, yes," said Ralph. "Don't you see his grip is still here?" "I know," said Uncle Claude. "I thought maybe your mother just put it here to make me feel at home." He was scrutinizing Ralph now, and Ralph knew what he saw. A thin, sallow creature with his knickers hanging down to the middle of his spindling legs, hideous braces on hideous teeth, glasses that made him look 99 years old. He felt that he must quickly speak before his uncle passed judgment on him and denied him permanently, but he could think of nothing to say. It would be unkind to tell him what it had been like when Grandpa had had his attack. It would be useless to apologize for his sisters, and his mother, and Mr. and Mrs. Follansby. What was there to say? Finally, in a thin, sing-song voice, he told Uncle Claude the joke about the cow, realizing with each word that it was not a bit funny, just as he had known a little while ago that Grandpa's story about the McNeils was not true. He did not even finish telling it, and when his voice trailed off, Uncle Claude did not even pay any attention, so that Ralph knew he had not been listening. After a long while, Uncle Claude said, "My father thought a lot of you. He was always saying he wished you'd come to visit me on my place." Then, with a smile which disarmed Ralph so that he nearly cried, he added, "But I guess you wasn't of the same mind." "My mother," Ralph began. "Oh, well, hell," said Uncle Claude. He had a funny way of smoking. He drew so deeply that the ember took great bites in the paper. Ralph remembered evenings when Grandpa had sat on the porch smoking, and the glow in the bowl of his pipe went on and off like a firefly. Uncle Claude said, "She never got over that about horses, did she? She would have kept me off 'em if she'd had her way, but Mr. Kenyon was stronger-minded than her." "Well, I guess she worried, about riding a horse and Grandfather getting the infection while he was watching her." He made his voice tentative. He did not really wish to be disloyal, and so he said, "I don't really think she killed him, though, do you?" "Jesus," said Uncle Claude. He sounded tired. In a minute, he said, "What do you do around here to keep busy?" There was very little that they did that would interest Uncle Claude. They were not allowed to climb trees, because splinters had been known to get into the bloodstream and travel to the heart. They did not have bicycles, and they were not allowed to build things. The very thought of a nail brought tears to their mother's splendid blue eyes. Nor to have roller skates or wagons. The girls played jacks and had all sorts of silly different games called dropsies and allsies and cart before the horse. He did not think that Uncle Claude would be interested in knowing that the most exciting thing he and Molly did was to watch Miguel harness the team. If Star and Swanee offered any resistance and tossed their heads, the Mexican slapped them on the nose with his gloves or gave them a wallop on the rump. He was not in the least afraid, even when they neighed at him angrily and their velvety lips rolled up, showing green teeth and a line of grass-stained foam on the underjaw. And Ralph was sure that Uncle Claude did not want to hear about their indoor pastimes. They had sets of watercolors and boxes of plasticine, and Mrs. Fawcett guided their fingers so expertly and so patiently that the results made everyone believe the children were unusually gifted. In the evenings and on rainy afternoons, she played games with them. They played Lotto and Authors and Parcheesi and I Spy, all of which Grandfather Bonnie had enjoyed. Sometimes she read aloud to them from The Little Shepherd of Kingdom Come, Sevenoaks, and The Old Curiosity Shop. When it was cool enough for a fire in the fireplace, they popped corn over the flames while the Edison played records of Grandfather Bonnie's favorite songs, The Green Hills of Home, All Through the Night, Old Black Joe, and I Dreamt That I Dwelt in Marble Halls. All of them, by the time they were 6, could recite The Brook and The Chambered Nautilus, and often they said them in unison, standing in a row in front of the bay window, their mother smiling proudly at them when she looked up from her crocheting. Leah and Rachel embroidered dresser scarves and tops for pincushions, and talked in a grown-up way with their mother about clothes, to his and Molly's embarrassment. Once Mrs. Fawcett had said, "I am making some curtains for Molly's sitting room," and held up a pair of bloomers right in front of Ralph. Ralph could not possibly tell Uncle Claude what a sissy life he had to lead. But he had to say something, and so doubtfully he began, "Well, Molly and I got sick last year, that's why we're so funny looking, but Dr. Haskell says we'll outgrow it. I didn't used to look like this." Uncle Claude said nothing, and there was no possible way to tell what he was thinking, for he did not smile or frown or have any kind of look on his face at all. "Anyway, we're too skinny or something to do anything much. We play mumbly peg a lot. We do a lot of things. I'm in the Yosemite Patrol. I'm going to tie knots at the Jamboree next spring." Why had Uncle Claude asked if he wasn't going to listen? He went back to the bed and lay down in the same position Ralph had found him in. "Don't you feel well, Uncle Claude?" "I don't know." "Did you ever hunt savage animals, Uncle Claude?" "You mean like tigers," he said, "or do you mean like deer?" "Either kind," said Ralph. Uncle Claude narrowed his eyes reflectively. "I get me a deer now and again, but a man couldn't call a deer a savage animal. I never seen a bear or a mountain lion. The chances are they might put up a fight if you didn't hunt them just according to Hoyle." "Is a mountain lion really savage?" said Ralph. "Why, son, if you was a settin' hen, he'd tear you limb from limb," said Uncle Claude, and laughed. A fat autumn fly thumped and fretted against the screen. "Uncle Claude?" He put his hand out and touched the handle of Grandpa's grip. "Uncle Claude, I think that maybe there's something that belongs to me in here." Uncle Claude did not open his eyes, but he smiled and said, "Sure, help yourself." The catches sprung back easily, and the mouth of the grip gaped wide, showing the familiar gray wads of clothing, a suit of winter underwear, nearly black around the neck, a few blue work shirts, a pair of denim overalls. Ralph took out everything and shook it and looked in the pockets and in the toes of the socks, but there were no presents. He came finally to the bottom where Grandpa's big blue-black revolver lay, and though he again shook each garment as he put it back in, he found nothing but Grandpa's own belongings. So what had happened? Had he felt bad in Texas, too bad to go to Mexico? You would think that in that case he would have at least brought some rattles off a rattlesnake. It was incredible, and it gave him a creepy feeling, knowing that this autumn they had been far from Grandpa's thoughts. And now he could not make Uncle Claude include him in his thoughts. He wondered suddenly if anyone in the world were thinking about him, Ralph Fawcett, at this moment. If anyone was, it was Molly sitting on top of the galoshes in the closet. For some reason he thought of the crazy pilot banking his plane like a hawk, and he said to himself, "Pilot, whoever you are, I am thinking about you." "Do you want to hear something funny, Uncle Claude?" Uncle Claude shrugged his shoulders. "I'd just as soon." Well, the other day, I went to get some brown sugar, and I put a whole lot of it in my mouth, and it wasn't brown sugar at all. I'll give you 3 guesses what it was. Cornmeal, said Uncle Claude. No, I mean, it looked like brown sugar, all right. Uncle Claude next guessed dried milk and oatmeal, even though Ralph had explained that it looked like brown sugar. It was nitrate fertilizer that Miguel had got to put on the 4 o'clocks. Uncle Claude chuckled. At least Ralph had won. Pleased as he was a little disquieted because this had happened to Molly, not to himself. So he quickly said, "But don't tell anybody because it would make Mother mad." "I wouldn't breathe it to a living soul," said Uncle Claude. "You know, it's a funny thing. At lunch I was just thinking about the time Mr. Kenyon got this here impetigo, and then your sister said Beulah had the itch. Why, he was wonderful. He didn't talk like the usual kind of grown-up at all. Ralph thought he was probably sincerely glad that Beulah got what she deserved for stealing Molly's nickel. He said, 'I like you, Uncle Claude.'" Uncle Claude stretched out his hand, beckoning to him. "I like you too, Ralph." Then he lay down beside his uncle, careful not to touch him. They lay there for a long time, dozing and waking. In all that time, Uncle Claude did not say a word, but twice he put his hand on the boy's thin shoulder. For the first time in days, Ralph was free of the smell of flowers. Uncle Claude had a smell something like Grandpa's, but it was younger and had less raisin in it, perhaps because he smoked cigarettes and his father had smoked a pipe. Soon after they heard Mr. Follansbee cranking his car and driving off, Uncle Claude sat up and yawned and said, "You come on out next summer to my place and bring what's-her-name along." "Well, I don't know if Molly can come. I think maybe something is going to happen to her." "Like what? Is she going to have her adenoids out?" "No, they're already out. I mean, well, Uncle Claude, strictly speaking, I think Molly's going crazy." Then he recited Gravel, which he had read so many times that he knew it by heart. Uncle Claude laughed, but he was puzzled too and said, "I wouldn't worry if I was you. I always did think that folks that wrote poems were bughouse but harmless. No, you bring her along." Ralph sucked at a wart on the heel of his hand, at first refusing the daydream, but he could not hold out against it, and he allowed it to overtake him and to crowd from his mind all else. Grandpa's neverness, the sermon next Sunday, the darkness of the coat closet, the embarrassment of the meal they would soon eat. When his mother called to him from the foot of the stairs, he left the shoes where he had put them right beside the orange Oxfords. But once again, when he had closed the door, the smell of flowers greeted him like an ocean wave. He moved toward his mother, toward Leah and Rachel, toward the portrait in the parlor. She called again sharply, "Ralph, how many times must I ask you to come downstairs?" "Hush," he whispered, leaning over the banister. "Don't you know Grandpa's dead?"